Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. So it's 5 o'clock, and I want to welcome you to another of what I expect will be a fantastic PARC Forum. My name is Aki Ohashi, and I am a Director of Business Development for Asia Pacific for PARC. And as most of you know, PARC is a subsidiary company of Xerox, and our core business is to conduct R&D for early stage technologies. And I work with many partners throughout the world to commercialize those technologies. And the regions where I focus on are kind of Asia Pacific, so Japan, Southeast Asia, Australia, and in fact, today sprinkled amongst you, there's also about 40 fantastic folks from the University of Melbourne EMBA program that are visiting, and they're also going to be part of this forum as well, so say hi to them if you run into them. And I met Andrew actually through a Japan event that he and I were both at a little while ago here in the Bay Area. And I'm Michael, and Michael introduced me to Andrew. Michael Eckhardt is the managing director and senior workshop leader at the Chasm Institute, and he is a veteran of Price Waterhouse PwC, Harbridge Consulting, Hewlett Packard, and PepsiCo. An MBA graduate of the Harvard Business School and a Wall Street Journal award winner, Michael is a recognized expert in leading 1-day and 2-day market strategy workshops aimed at one specific client outcome: accelerating growth for their technology-based products and services in the next 12 to 24 months. So I think that's probably why a lot of you folks are here, to learn about that. And so in many tech-based companies, and that includes PARC, I would say, based on some of my personal observations, we have smart people, smart teams, and great ideas. But as many of you may also have noticed, even with these resources, it can be very challenging to launch and scale next-generation innovations in areas such as IoT, cloud computing, AI, big data analytics, and blockchain, to name a few. It has taken years for technologies like 3D printing to find compelling market applications beyond initial prototyping, and many years for machine learning to achieve mainstream market appeal beyond the initial market applications in voice recognition and natural language processing. Why do some great innovations succeed while some languish? So in this PARC Forum, Michael will discuss the principles of technology adoption based on predictive frameworks and models, as well as real-world examples from the Chasm Institute, a consulting and advisory company specializing in helping tech-based companies achieve market-leading positions. Michael will share their experiences and insights, having analyzed best practices in launching and scaling innovations, and having applied those learnings to help companies large and small cross the chasm, from disruptive technology innovation to mainstream market appeal. So can you please help me welcome Michael with a warm round of applause.
Well, good afternoon. Hello. Good evening, depending on what time zone you came in on. I want to welcome you to the afternoon. What Aki just mentioned is kind of the context for what we're going to cover here in the next 55 minutes. And I'm honored that you're here today. I know you're all busy. Traffic is not friendly at this hour coming in on 280 and so forth, so thanks for being here. Couple things as we get started. One is the topic, how to launch and scale high-tech growth innovations. Fundamentally, there's a myth. There's actually a lie in U.S. economics that says that U.S. corporations, the large ones, are not very innovative. And that it's the small ones, the startups, the newer ones, and of course there's some truth to that part. There's a lot of innovation on the young side. But the big companies, they have lots going on in R&D, in labs, in software development, in a lot of areas, some of them that Aki just mentioned. It's not an innovation problem at all. It's actually a go-to-market problem. It's how do you actually get these amazing ideas, filter them, because there's not all amazing or equally amazing, and get the good ones out. And get them out in time and not, God, that could have been us doing LinkedIn or IoT along the lines of what a major US company you're going to hear in a minute is working on. So the idea about timing and speed and traction and kind of a real systematic approach to the market is what we're going to cover here based on really the last 225 clients that we've worked with here in the last 15 plus years. Also want to introduce Andrew Salzman, one of our senior people at Chasm Institute. Andrew will also be answering questions, all the tough questions you can hold for Andrew. So during the refreshments later on, he's one, in addition to myself, that will be being able to answer some questions. We'll do some very brief Q&A with microphones in the last 5 minutes of this session. The idea about best practices, I also want to say that we are highly devoted to worst practices. We believe that great companies and great people have to be thinking both ways, both what works and actually what doesn't work. And so we're going to give you both best and worst practices for going to market. And the idea, and I think a number of you may have seen or known or read about our Chasm model, the idea is the early market that you're going to hear about is the easiest part of the market you will ever go into. These people are enthusiasts like you are. They're tech savvy. They're only about 8 to 11% of the market. They're not normal people. Some of you in the room might reflect that population. In fact, we overpopulate for that in Silicon Valley, and that's a problem. Because the other 90 or 95% of customers, if you do the full math on this, aren't early adopters. They actually want products that work, that are like blissfully easy to apply. Plug and play, not plug and pray. You know, the whole idea about making things easy. And so what we at Chasm Institute have been working on over the last 15 plus years is really the idea that there is a systematic approach. And so we're going to be sharing with you frameworks, tools, real examples from what others and we have gone through over the last 15 plus years. I want to first also thank PARC for hosting this event. Aki Ohashi, who I met about 3 months ago, Anna Anario, who's one of the senior people at PARC, and then Victor Chu as well. They've all done a great job of putting this event on this afternoon. So timing, we'll do about 55 minutes of this content. We'll do some Q&A for 5 or 7, maybe 10 minutes, and then we'll do basically refreshments, but also informal Q&A after that. Hopefully you've gotten a copy of the newest Crossing the Chasm book. The ink isn't quite still wet in it, but it's about a year old. It's a third version of the Chasm book. And hopefully you got one. If you didn't get one on the way in, please make sure you get one on the way out. Okay, enough of that. Couple things as we kind of jump into the material. One is there's a lot of buzzwords, a lot of noise, and I think this is one of the slides you have on your cheat sheet. A lot of things happening in the Valley here, but also in Boston or Bangalore or UK or Germany. And what you'll see is all of these areas, whether it's big data or cloud or VR and AR, you know, all of these areas, they're being talked about. The amount of noise, the amount of talking, the amount of white papers, the amount of conferences has nothing to do with where these things sit on the adoption curve. What you're going to see in a few minutes is that even something like AI, like artificial intelligence, has been actually quagmired in the early market for 27 years. Some of you in the room here are not 27 years old, right? And so the idea is we've finally seen in the last 2 or 3 or 4 years some AI applications moving across in cybersecurity, in voice recognition, but lots of white papers, lots of talking, lots of noise, and not a lot of real implementation until quite recently, the last 2 or 3 years, like I said. So let me ask as we get started with the group here in the room, anybody see something up here in the yellow that kind of reflects what they're working on today? Just a quick show of hands. I'm hoping, wow, cool, okay, about 2/3, okay. Those areas, those 9, we've picked them pretty carefully. We think they represent about the next $1 trillion in revenue. When you think of the opportunity, and right now it's July of 2016, and we all know that some of these are going to pop. Some of these are going to actually move forward pretty quickly. Even things like IoT are not new concepts, new constructs. They've been around for a dozen years or more. But the technology, the sensors, the data capacities haven't been in place yet until very recently. But here's the problem, is everybody knows that list of 9 trends. And now let's fast forward from July 2018 to July 2020, 2 years out in the future. You look back and you go, so some companies actually figured out how to go to market with this, and others are still in the lab, or still talking about it, or still publishing their second white paper, or have a couple early adopter trials, but there's no real commercialization yet. And so what we're going to say is we'd love to have you in the room here have what we call a no regrets strategy, which is when you look back 24 months back, are there things you can definitely say we did a few of these things right? Not perfectly, nobody does that, but did you get the right target customers in mind? Did you get your pricing model in place? Did you pick the right focus area, the right geography? Do you know how many times we've heard about, well, we're different than everyone else. We're going to have a worldwide, global rollout of this new innovation. There's a chill that runs down my back whenever I hear that. Because if you do that with what we call disruptive innovation, you'll be the first one on the planet, first one to ever get that right. And if you want to be the first one, go ahead, but I'm not sure that's the leadership you're looking for. Every innovation has started with some level of, am I allowed to use the F word here? I will. Focus. You thought it was the other F word. Yes, I know. The word focusing on some problem to be solved that's bigger and hairier and more painful than others out there. And whether you think of mobile phones, or whether you think of facial recognition, or whether you think of big data, it's not a horizontal, it's a vertical operation initially. And so I promise you we're going to get into some of that. It sounds like about 2/3 of you have kind of a life in one of these areas. And even if not there, you'll see there's other elements of what we think are kind of major themes. Things like, customer experience innovation, or obviously security and privacy, top of mind for a lot of you here in the room. And so as we go through this, a couple things kind of to mention. One is nobody gets it perfect, and you won't either, and we won't either. But the learning process, I really don't like the term, have you heard the term fast failure? It's like, how about fast learning? How about moving quickly, testing with customers, getting it out there, validating it, and then figuring out where to move? I would consider that not fast failure, that's fast learning. Can you do that quicker? And it's not just marketing, it's the R&D team, it's the support team, it's the customer success team. And so what we've tried to do at Chasm Institute, and the work we've done the last 15 plus years, about 500 engagements if you add up the total number, multiple engagements for the same companies, of course. And the idea is, whether you're in B2B or B2C, the idea about getting to market and dominating some segment of customers first is integral to most success you're going to see in the next 5 or 10 years in any one of those 9 trends. So I got some good news and some bad news for you. Some of you tell me that you're B2B, and some of you tell me that you're B2C. A dirty little secret that we're going to talk about later is it's rare that most new technologies win initially in B2C. I know it's bigger. I know there's 330 million Americans and 350 million people in the EU and all that stuff. But the reality is most pain points solved in what we call chasm crossing mode is actually a business problem with a real P&L impact in it. Even mobile phones, every aunt, uncle, daughter, son has one now, but the first 50 million mobile phones actually went B2B, not B2C. You might forget that now. It was executives, but even sales reps and others who couldn't live without the business applications around smartphones, not about the social applications. Later, we get deluded by thinking, well, it's horizontal. Look, 8 billion people on the planet, 5 billion have a phone. How hard was that? Turns out it just means you weren't the product manager on those businesses when these things launched. Oh, by the way, another myth, actually a lie. Have you read about first mover advantage? There's no such correlation in first mover advantage, meaning first market entrant wins. Zero correlation. We've looked at this over hundreds of companies in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. You're going to see that first mover advantage has nothing to do with it. Nokia had one of the first smartphones. If you remember this eyeglass case-like product called the Nokia Communicator, I think the 910 and 920 series I recall. And the rule, by the way, at Nokia was you're not allowed to call it a phone because it ain't a phone. We're going to call it a personal digital assistant. What are you calling your thing these days? It's still a freaking phone, right? It's just a smarter phone. But the reality is Nokia was very early, and that gives you no ability to dominate later as an automatic weapon forward. What we'll say is first mover advantage is a myth. What we're going to say instead, and be careful for any consultant who talks about, like rhymes, because sometimes we get a little too cute, but it's not first mover advantage, it's first prover advantage. And by first prover advantage, what we mean is who's the first company to actually deliver the whole product, the total solution to the customer. And so we actually say first prover is the one that wins. That was Apple in iPods. By the way, there were 8 different digital music companies before Apple, and none of them built the ecosystem Apple did. When you go back now 10 years, 12 years to that kind of illustrious beginning of the digital music business, and it certainly wasn't Sony. Amazing company, but not so amazing in going from analog to digital. But this idea about first prover, Apple built a full set of ecosystem around it, iTunes, et cetera, that others really didn't have. And so the idea that we need to actually focus on whole product, and you'll see in a minute that's a theme, and in fact it's a theme from, we think we learn something new every 2 or 3 years, and that's when we write a book, or we update a book. The newest Crossing the Chasm book that you have, we call that Crossing the Chasm 3.0. Some of you were still in, I think, elementary school or earlier when the first book came out. Okay, maybe some of you were already out of school then. This is in the 90s. What we've learned and taken forward since then is the idea that there's at least a few fundamental changes in what we call the technology adoption life cycle. We'll talk about those in a few minutes. Sold about 3 million books. It's not that many books, actually, over 15 years. Harry Potter sold like 3 million books like on Tuesday afternoon during their boom time. So, you know, shame on us. It took us a while to get to 3 million. But we think some of the right people have actually read the books that we have. So here's the good news. The good news is what you have, if you're an executive or a product manager or a director of product or a marketing executive, the idea that we need to understand and win in particular markets, and the idea that the technology adoption roadmap, we call it the tech market model, is actually a path or a map that can help you give some granularity to what it is you need to do. Some of you are familiar with the first curve. The first curve, we call that the technology adoption life cycle. That basically mirrored and mapped what's the initial adoption and at what speed and what rate of first-time users of a new technology. Over the last 3 to 5 years, we've built on top of that to make it the tech market model, this green area called Main Street. Too many executives thought just because you get through initial adoption, the game has been won, and after Tornado, you have to go back and like invent something else. And the reality is if you manage Main Street right, the way Apple has, the way Samsung is attempting to, the way Adobe has, the way other companies have, that idea is you can have a 5 to 15-year competitive advantage on Main Street. You can't get lazy. You can't say we got a 15-year edge. Nobody has that anymore. But you can stitch together 3 to 5-year advantages to make it 15 years. And so the idea is this is actually a curve that is a very, very cruel curve. Have you met companies who go, you know what? We didn't win in Chasm Crossing. We'll define these terms in a minute. We didn't win in Tornado, but we're going to win on Main Street. Good luck to you. You're number 11 on a list of 11 players, and you've got 6% market share. And congratulations, you grew at 10% last year, and now you're at 6.6% market share. That's not going to get you the behemoths on Main Street. You know how cruel this is? If we don't get Chasm Crossing right, and later the Main Street piece, my favorite part of the pen is the eraser, as you can probably tell, is there's actually 2 companies. Last year, in 2017, during a 6-month period, these 2 companies in mobile phones, this is how cruel this is, accounted for 125% of the profit in the mobile phone business. How can anybody have more than 125%? It's easy. There's 25 competitors. 23 are breaking even or losing money. In some geographies, they might be strong. They're doing great in China, but they can't get into the US or into Western Europe. 120, what does that mean for the other 23 companies? The bad news is the other 23, and by the way, number 3 or 4 is doing okay, but if you're 7 or 8, this is a very cruel cycle to you. And a lot of the profits are not on the hardware. I mean, you saw the numbers from Apple, $35 billion in sales in apps. That's a tremendous amount of power that we have here. And so the work that Andrew and I do and others that you'll be hearing about, it's everything to do with, we hope, practical, applicable, systematic thinking about what we do. And the work, and we're a group of about 20 people in total throughout the Chasm family. Jeffrey Moore is my boss. He's the chairman of the company. I'm one of the managing directors. Been working with Jeff for over 15 years, or actually 20 years. And the reality is, these are examples of clients of ours. you know, when you think of some of these companies that both I've had a chance to work with and Andrew, one that just released their numbers, that's been a client of ours for 2 years. We cannot claim credit for the first, you know, like 70 million paid customers. But the last 2 years, they just hit, Spotify did, 80 million, not dollars, 80 million paid customers. Yeah. Each paying $9.99. Now, they haven't become profitable yet. They have a huge amount of commitment financially to the talent. They got to pay the royalties on the music. But they went public. They're doing reasonably well. They think by Q1 of next year, profitability is going to hit. But the reality is this is a 7-year-old company doing 80 million people a month paying $9.99. You're all good at arithmetic. That's 800 million in cash flow a month. Now, it's not true that the musicians don't make any money on this stuff, because most of that money is going to them right now, just to be clear, and it will continue to. But they're growing at 60% a year. And Apple's doing fairly well, too. That's the two big battles going on. You know how cruel this is? Check out Pandora and see how they're doing compared to these two. Pretty tough, pretty tough. And so the reality is you and your businesses and some of the exciting work that you're doing, if you're in one of these areas, we think what we have to cover here today and the book, and we encourage you to read at least the first third of the book over the next few days if you haven't had a chance to. If you're in one of these businesses, a dynamic business, a disruptive industry, in whether B2B and B2C, this is the kind of areas that we at Chasm Institute work on with our clients, with our consulting workshops. We encourage people to read the books and so forth too. Generic consumer goods, generic commodity products, not so good. We really don't add value there. There's one word on this page that is incredibly annoying to me, maybe to you too. It's overused. It's the word disruptive. I want to gag every time I hear that these days. Just too much of that being used as kind of buzzwordiness without even defining it. Have you noticed that too? The last 5 or 7 years, like, please, let's stop. Can we find either a synonym for it or at least define you know, I had a disruptive breakfast this morning, or once again, my mother-in-law was disruptive during the holidays, or my father-in-law, or whatever, blah, blah, blah. We have a very specific terminology for whether your technology is disruptive or not. There's actually 3 markers, 3 factors. And if 2 of them are a yes or a strong yes, we have a video on this you can find on our LinkedIn page or on our homepage for our website. But basically, there's 3 criteria. And I'm just going to write the words up here. Behavior, skill, and process. Process could also be workflow. And our test is, if you have a new technology, IoT, facial recognition, big data applications in more intelligent, predictive ways, the question really is does that solution require a change in one of these or 2 of these or 3 of these areas? The one is change in behavior by the customer. They have to do something different that they didn't have to do before to absorb or use this technology. Change in behavior. In fact, part of it is that they think differently about the way to use the problem. We'll get to some examples in a moment. Secondly, pretty obvious, skill. Do you have to retrain somebody? By the way, if something goes from being manual to being automated, and you go, that's good, right? You go, yeah, that's great. It's still disruptive. It changes workflow. Does that make sense? It doesn't go to Main Street right away just because it manages an automated process that was formerly manual. The third one is process or workflow. And if 2 out of these 3 are yeses or strong yeses, then what you have is a fairly disruptive solution. So let's take a couple quick examples. Apple, when they announced that their new iPhone has a 40% longer battery life, which is pretty cool. Who's going to vote against that? For the customer, is that a continuous innovation in mature market, or is that disruptive innovation? Continuous. Now, if you're the engineer working on the battery life, you're going, man, that wasn't easy. That was hard. We worked hard for 3 years, and to get to that level, and the lithium-ion technology, that's not continuous. It is. To the customer, it's, oh, look, I can use this phone more often during the day and not have to recharge till the evening or even the next morning. Pretty cool. Has nothing to do with how hard you're working at this. Let's be clear on it. So that's continuous. Teslas, we see about 80 or 90 or 100 of them on the highways each day. By the way, that's the Bay Area. Go to LA, go to Boston, go to Philadelphia, you won't see 80 or 90. And yeah, it's true, a few of them are employees that work for Elon and all that, but the reality is most of these are normal people buying, well, early adopters buying the car. Behavior, skill, and process change is the Tesla. And as we think through kind of who the companies are that we both, work with, Tesla is not a client of ours, but we actually study them pretty carefully. About 2/3 of the companies on this list are clients of ours. The other third are ones that we've studied fairly carefully. These are kind of growth and related companies. Sorry, it's getting cut off a little bit at the top. And then the big guys, obviously, we work with a lot of them as well. The Salesforces of the world, the SAPs and others, and about 2/3 there. But the Tesla question. Is the electric automobile from Tesla, does that pass the test of being a continuous innovation, or is that a disruptive innovation today as of July 2018? What do you think? Yeah. So because you live in Silicon Valley, you have a bias, which is, hey, it's got 4 wheels, it's got a steering wheel, it's got electric windows. The only difference is the power source. It's not that big a deal. What we need to be careful about is there is a change in 2 out of these 3 for customers, and what the test is of that, it's not continuous. Not because I say so or because you might agree or disagree. It's, does the customer who buys and uses this car see a change in behavior, skill, or process? And the answer on skill is no. You don't have to get recertified for driving and go to the DMV to figure out how to drive a Tesla. It's all the same, pretty much. But the other 2 are profoundly different, and part of it is the idea that whole product is different. So let's dig into this just for a moment to make sure we have some clarity on that. What's the change in behavior? And we're not talking about a Volt here. We're not talking about a hybrid Prius. Let's talk about high-performance cars from BMW, Mercedes, electric. Those are still very nascent. And then the Tesla. When you're driving, do you have to think any differently than you do when you're driving a normal luxury sedan? You're going to Tahoe, right? Going to be a 4-hour drive, depending on traffic. You jump in the car with your family. Do you ever have to worry about, are there any fuel stations along the way that you can actually get to range-wise? Have you ever thought about that with a full? You haven't. Tesla's done a great job in the Bay Area of building out the ecosystem, recharging stations, et cetera. The old kind of funny but not so funny story is you have 2 kids in the back seat, they're arguing, they're fighting, you're on your way to Tahoe, mom and dad are in the front. You pull into a gas station with your regular car, you go, hey kids, come on, calm down, we'll get you some water or some milk or whatever at the convenience place at the gas station. We'll be back on the road in 10 minutes, please. Come on, enjoy, we're gonna get on the way. Until pretty recently, it was kids, can you hang on? In 4 hours, we'll be back on the road again after we kind of re-electrified this automobile and gotten back out there. Try that on your family and see how that will work. Or having to rewire your house perhaps for having, those are all changes in the greater model, not the use model of the specific car. That doesn't mean bad. That means it's actually progressing very quickly. And we have a number, I won't ask for a raise of hands, but probably a good percentage of people here in the room drive a Tesla or have one in the family. The reality is that behavior and workflow and process, and that's why Elon Musk just put 10,000 mobile repair vans on the highways in the US, because he knows he doesn't have time to build the ecosystem of repair shops. So he wants mobile to get out there and fix their vans. I checked. I don't think they're electric vans, are they? They're gasoline-powered vans. There's an irony in that. Okay, all right. So use that as a judgment about your solution, and I'm guessing that for a lot of you, the idea that these technologies, there's a lot of cloud today that is now continuous innovation because cloud's been around for a while, but it's kind of hard to argue that virtual and augmented reality today are non-disruptive, meaning continuous or blockchain and such. And it doesn't mean bad, it just means different. And so what I'd like to put in front of you here today is really the idea that there's 3 fundamental questions. Man, there's lots of questions you can ask as you're launching a new product. But here's 3 that if you get these right, you raise the probability quite high that you've got yourself a tiger by the tail, meaning a product market fit. If you can't answer these 3, then good luck to you. You've got a vision, you've got an idea, you've got a hope, but you don't have a plan. And so let's take a brief look at each one of these 3 questions. And the first one seems like an easy one, and it's not. It's a mapping exercise which says the TMM, sorry about the acronym, the tech market model. Where are we on this tech market model today? And the where question gets kind of complicated, and we're going to define some of these terms in a few minutes, but it turns out that over the last 3 to 5 years, we've expanded the definitions of not just early market, chasm, bowling alley, et cetera. We'll define a few of those, I promise, before the 55 minutes is up. But it turns out there's actually 14 different stages in the adoption of a new technology. We call this the headache slide. I know what you're thinking. Consultants make everything too freaking complicated. Can't we stay with 5 stages, not 14? What's wrong with that? Turns out we're not making it complicated. Your world is complicated. And if you're in early market, and sorry about the small font here, and you're in 1A, don't dream, hope, wish, delusionally think about chasm crossing. It's go find a few early adopters to engage with. But if you're in 1C, which means late early market, you've got yourself an opportunity now to start figuring out how do you get to the normal marketplace over here. And so we've divided up and stratified the different stages with data and with experience over those last 225 companies that we work with. So the mapping question is actually an important one, and I actually plead with you, okay, I'll beg of you, before you launch a product, I don't mean like next week, like a week before launch, but 6 months to 9 months before you launch, ask yourself what seems like a simple question but isn't. And that question is, when we launch, if it's now in July or August of 2018, or if we're launching in mid-year 2019, when this product launches, where will it land on the tech market model? I beg of you to ask yourself that question, because you're asking lots of great questions already. Feasibility, can we deliver on this product? Is there a real value proposition? Are we solving a customer's problem? Do we have a sales force that gives a rip about this product? Are there third parties, et cetera? But the one question, which is the where question, and I don't mean where your investors hope you're going to land, because that's the wrong people to ask. Or the idea that there's this, like, the hockey stick thing, which says, well, it's going to be slow for a couple quarters, but we're going to ramp in Q4. You've all heard those lies. The idea is, if we figure out where we are on this model, and the book will give you some insight into that. We obviously do workshops to go deeper into this, but the book will give you some level of it. It'll give you much greater certainty and understanding. Now, let's be really careful about something. If you have 3 people in a garage here in Palo Alto who say, Apple, their music system is okay for streaming, and Spotify's is okay too, but man, do we have something better. And we're going to launch next year. And they better watch out, because we're going to get ready to really take their share. And you ask those people, it's 3 of them, they're alumni of other companies, they're starting a company in the garage, where are you today on the tech market model? You go, hey, that's not so hard. We're in the early market. We're still working on our product. And that ain't the answer. Music streaming today in the US is here, in Tornado. When growth rates exceed 45% or more in unit growth rate, and that's what Apple and Spotify are enjoying, and it's not just early adopters, but it's normal customers, you see a massive growth rate for not that long, by the way, 3 to 5 years. Those people in the garage who think they're in early market, they're not. The train has actually left the station, and they're not on the train. Now, unless they have a music streaming thing that's highly disruptive, that's going to take the entire market and do this, well, we're going to reset everybody with a chip behind their ear that will require music streaming now to be kind of in conjunction with your brain waves, and you allow yourself to have a playlist based on not even knowing what you... That's interesting, but that's change in behavior, skill, and process. That ain't competing with Spotify and Apple. Oh, and there's another rule. When there's a category in Tornado, it's really hard to disrupt it, because customers are buying for the first time and using for the first time, and they're just getting comfortable with the current status quo, not the new stuff. So the innovators over here, you'll get the 5%, but you are not here. If you're in the garage, you're actually here. And you're not enjoying it. And you may not even know you're there. Does that make sense? That this is not about you or your navel or where you think, it's where does the market put you? So the reality is that this is a fairly challenging set of metrics, and there's a slide deck that we'll be happy to send you that talk about what are these different stages. I'm just going to hit on one specific stage here in this conversation, and that's the stage that we talk about in chasm crossing. And by chasm crossing, when we say chasm crossing, chasm has gotten a bad reputation. It's not a bad thing at all. Let me just get that going there. Chasm is the divide between the early market and the main marketplace. This is the 8, and this is being very generous, by the way, the 8 to 11% of the market sitting on the left-hand side. You know who you are. You're the ones that self-installed a Nest thermostat 3 years ago on your own. Anybody do that? Yeah, of course you are. That's why you're here. And you thought the screwdriver in the package was such a thoughtful, incredible whole product for that customer base. And you go, oh my God, this group here, and by the way, Nest has done an amazing job with that. We've had the privilege, Andrew and I, of working with Nest. They put together a wonderful, what we call whole product for this early market. It even included a screwdriver, brackets, screws, everything to put it up. Great. There's a problem with that. And the problem is that is an optimized whole product for the early market who want to do it yourself, who want to install yourself, and you're actually proud. By the end of Saturday or Sunday when you have that installed and working, you are like the master of your own domain. You've gotten it achieved. You didn't even have to read the directions, which is really cool, and the screwdriver was just an amazing additive to it. What about the other 85 or 90% of customers? You know what they're waiting for? Yeah, they actually have a life outside of hobbies and do-it-yourself. They'd like somebody in a van to drive up to their house who, the tool belt, man or woman, but sometimes it's usually a guy, 55 years old, who've been installing Honeywell devices for the last X years, and they come in and they put it on the wall for you. And the problem is that right now, an amazing company like Nest has an opportunity in front of them, but they got to figure out what partners to work with. And the challenge is this. It's not just adoption by the customers. It's adoption by the service providers. People over here haven't been selling Nest products and installing them. A lot of them are 55 years old. They go, this is an awesome thing. Tell you what, I'm retiring in 5 years. My son or daughter is going to take over the business. They'll drive the van around and do the installation, have the tool belt on. But for now, it's me. Don't mess up my next 5 years, please. I want to keep doing what I'm doing and then let the new generation take care of it. The problem is that extends the adoption rate for another 5 years. Am I making this up? This is like how real behavior happens in economies when it comes to disruption, even though the device is amazing. And so what we see is that to get across this chasm, there's a wall. And we call it the whole product wall, or the whole product barrier is probably a better way to put it. And what it does is you can start trying to cut price. You can try to, I'm going to use a very technical term on you here, spray and pray. You can go horizontal and broad and then pray that somebody somewhere is going to buy your product. Good luck on that strategy. By the way, spray and pray, not a bad thing later when done in the right context, but here it's deadly. You'll fail. And so the real marker, the real requirement in getting across the chasm is to find some segment or segments, usually it's 1 or 2, it's not 5 or 6, and these are applications. These could be verticals, they're not always verticals, they could be communities. And these are actually areas where customers, normal customers, are ready to buy and use because they have enough pain to say the old status quo no longer works for them. And if you try to push a product across that is an 80% whole product, these people over on the right-hand side, they can smell it before you know it that you don't have a whole solution. And I'm not talking perfect solution because that's not the requirement. It's actually minimum viable whole product. Mouthful, terrible acronym, we know. But MVWP, this is not about lean. Lean is early market, get it out there, test it, et cetera. That's MVP. This is minimum viable whole product. Does it have all the complementary services, solutions, legacy interfaces, connectivity, all the stuff needed? And those are usually like 15 to 25 elements. It's not just 2 or 3. And those enablers, plus the core, we have at Chasm, we have very little worries about our clients' core products. Some of the most amazing, brilliant people here in Silicon Valley are working on the core product, and it's just world-beating. But that's how you win in the early market. The normal marketplace says we actually want a full, safe solution, not just the core product. That includes install, or the right application software, or post-sale support, or actually even references from normal customers, not the early people. And so what that gets us to is the following, is that if we don't have that, we've got ourselves a problem. We've hit this barrier, this whole product barrier. This only allows whole products through, which you actually like that if you're not trying to sell. If you're a customer, you say, can you keep the bad ideas to the left of this, please, and only let us buy when it's ready? So I'm presenting to a group of people who are like PhD chemists a month ago in a bioscience business, and they go, wow, it only allows the whole products through. Michael, is this kind of like a semi-permeable membrane that allows certain molecules through and others it rejects? I go, that's exactly what it is. And you can do things like, hey, you know what worked last time? We cut price by 10%. That's not a bad strategy for Main Street. A 10% price cut's not going to get you there. In fact, the only thing you'll do is damage your margins, reducing further any money you actually have to develop the market. And so what we're going to see in the process is we've got to find a specific level of application around a segment, and that may be, and should be and could be, a geography, an application, a type of customer who see each other as relevant references within that segment. And we've got 30 examples in the book, whether it's from Documentum, one of our first clients, to, hey, even Spotify. They didn't do spray and pray. The first segment for them, the first 30 million customers, the first 3 million customers for them were the Nordics. And that's a lot of people in the Nordics, by the way, because Sweden's only got like 7 million people, right? So Sweden, Norway, Denmark. Now they happen to be headquartered in Stockholm. At the time, it was like, darn, I wish we had more money so we could do like a worldwide launch. It's like, thank God you didn't have money for that. Go dominate something. And then they went to Western Europe. Then they went to the US. They just launched in Japan last year, which is kind of odd because usually Japan is early adopting. And the reality is this could be geography-based as well. Okay. Now, the first question is the where question. We won't go further into that one now, but it really drives us into the second question, which is, okay, so what does that mean? What does that mean for where we're going to attack if we truly are in what we're going to call chasm crossing or chasm readiness mode? How do we pick? And now a concept rears its ugly head. It's been in meetings this week with some of you. We heard it with our clients. It's TAM. It's total addressable market. Bring me the biggest, hairiest, mother of all opportunities, and there too we shall win. By the way, no correlation between size of segment and your victory. I'd much rather find a medium-sized segment that has a high pain point than a large segment who goes, interesting, but come back next year when the product's more solid. And so TAM is a wonderful set of constructs for when you're thinking later about the main marketplace. But today, it's not about TAM when you're crossing the chasm. It's about specific segments, specific applications. And so the thought process, and you can actually, we're happy to share these slides with you later, you can actually get to a stage and the mapping absolutely about where you are based on some very clear criteria that in this session here we're not going to address, but basically knowing where you are across the full stages. But what I was getting at, what's really important, is the where question follows into the what or how question. Which market opportunity should we attack? And by the way, here's an area that's a little challenging for some of us. I know it was for me in the companies that I worked with previously, and that is this, what do we cross out? You were in meetings this week. How easy is it to cross out opportunities? I mean segments, customer groups. It's like, no, we're leaving money on the table. If you have a disruptive innovation, you're not leaving money on the table. The F word comes back and rears its ugly head, which is focus, which says, and we have 225 examples of what it takes to actually win in deciding where to go and where not to go. And here's just a quick kind of short list of 7 or 8 companies that say if you can't find a beachhead segment to attack and also decide what to cross out, whether it's Apple, I won't give away the punchline, but Apple, in its first year and a half of the iPod, 70% all of customers came from one demographic, actually from one gender and one age group. That's how narrow the verticalization was. Now it's, 18 months later, 24 months later, LinkedIn had a high, strong geographical focus. We talked about Spotify already. A Workday, great example there. My favorite example is Amazon. Today, this multi-billion-dollar behemoth, powerful, destroying actually, or at least competing and putting away a lot of retail. What did they start with? Did they have any focus? Books. Can you find a more dull category? Whoops, we sell books. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. Why did Amazon, for the first 6 years, hit one key on the piano, and that was books? It wasn't lawn furniture, it wasn't wedding rings, it wasn't shoes, it was one thing. Why was it books? Do you ever ask yourself? Because Jeff Bezos is a smart guy, and he has 2 reasons for that. 6 years of building out an e-commerce platform and only selling books. There's 2 reasons. First one, it's a volume business, but that's not enough. The other is that Amazon had great empathy, which is rare of high-tech companies, and they understood that the main marketplace had a concern with e-commerce back 15 years ago. And that concern is, when I'm buying online, how different is it going to be than the stuff I'm buying brick and mortar? Shoes, is it leather or Corinthian leather? Remember Ricardo Montalban? If you're a certain age, you'll know what I'm talking about. Is it real leather? Is it not? Is it going to fit me? Is it not? Do I like the diamond? All that. Books were the one thing that Amazon tested for that said, you know what? A Stephen King book online and in brick and mortar at Barnes & Noble is the same thing. And that took away the concern of adopting a category. And for 6 years, they hit that note on the piano. Let me ask you, how many of you would have the discipline in your business to go, we're going to take that bet, and then later sell 100 million products, but start with one? And by the way, Amazon today has the millions of products over here, but they began with the one. But please don't tell me that Amazon, this makes things a little bit more granular when we think about it, is that you got to find what we call a beachhead or an initial segment to go into. Now, even Amazon has challenges. I won't get into the details, but the anniversary is coming up next month of Amazon buying Whole Foods for $13.5 billion. Why? Well, lawn furniture and books and PCs and you name it, Amazon's been kicking butt on that on Main Street. But what about fresh foods? How many of you go, we're going to barbecue this weekend. Let's go find some good Kobe beef or some good halibut at Amazon and go order that. You're a pretty non-normal person to be doing that. And we have some of you in the room. It's okay. You're still good people. Okay? Most people go, I'm not so sure about it. For $13.5 billion, Amazon actually got into that category because they were actually in the chasm with fresh foods. And now they're the last mile on the retail is what, and they didn't pick Safeway. They picked a brand that really kind of allowed them to get in at a higher end. And the reality is Amazon was actually in the chasm with fresh food and on Main Street with everything. So please take away kind of a lesson from this that we learned the hard way, which is companies aren't anywhere on this. It's their product categories. And you can have HP having sold 400 million printers in Main Street and 3D printing over here. Make sense? Oh, and if you take your best people over here who've made your numbers every year and they're amazing, and you put over here, our experience is only 18 to 20% of those people with those skills can actually migrate over to the new stuff. So there's actually even some HR and some organizational design issues that come into play here. So this idea about how to focus, what we've done, and Andrew and I and others, we've actually built a tool set that says, to get across this chasm, it turns out that there's 9 factors. You probably thought there were hundreds of ways to fail when you launch a new product as disruptive. There's actually 9. And those 9 areas are 9 specific levels of this. And again, if you want the details, we're happy to share the slides with you. But basically, there's 9 criteria that tell us whether or not we're going to win in a segment. And we've actually put some analytics around this that we go through in our workshops. You get a taste of it here that says you can take each of those 9 and score those. And if you don't have a score of greater than or equal to an 80, and I get we're going through this very quickly, but it's basically the rendering of just the idea, is the analytics say that if you score an 80 out of 100 on these 9 variables, each one weighted somewhat differently, whole products more important than the 1x ones, that you actually have an opportunity to actually nail it, win it with high correlation. If you get a score of a 71, but your GM or executive goes, you know what, that's a big market. We're still going to go after. 71 out of 100 is pushing rope. You're not going to, it means there's some fundamental flaws in either the customer's understanding of their problem, or your inability to deliver whole product, or your channel's not ready to go, or the core enablers are not in place, and so forth. And so the idea is that those numbers actually don't lie. We built a set of experiences around the last 5 or 7 years of doing this. And it really does say that, you know, whether you're Salesforce, and by the way, the mythology about Salesforce is that they started with enterprise, because man, look at all the enterprise got. They started with SMB. That was enterprise they came later to. The problem is we look back in the mirror and go, oh, look at all those guys going after enterprise. Turns out that their chasm crossing was SMB, and then later they scaled to the new levels. And if you do the scoring based on those criteria, it tells us exactly why large CIOs at large companies were a little bit, I'm 55 years old, please come back in 5 years when I've retired. I'm not ready to move to Salesforce now. Don't make me do this. And so none of these questions or none of these issues are easy ones. But even for great companies, you know, if we wrap this up and pull it together and say, what is it? You know, if you think of Nest as a consumer IoT, some of you are great customers of Nest. I'm a big believer in it. Andrew is as well. They've right now got a challenge as they think through, you know, the next 12 to 18 months. And that challenge is really, how do they move forward? And what is their chasm crossing? They've actually got millions of dollars in revenues in the early market, and their decision right now is, which of these areas are they going to push forward? Is it the thermostat? Is it the smoke alarm? Is it security cameras? Some of you in the room are going to say, you know what, that would make a really cool bundle, all 3 of those groups together. That's what I would buy. Your early market, you're 8% of people. Most people go, I ain't buying all those. Show me one of those first as a proof point. So if you just said, man, isn't that a great family of products? I want to buy them all. You're part of the 8 to 11% in the early market. Congratulations. And I think we have a high percentage of people here. All right. So the challenge for them is really to figure that out. The last question in the last couple of minutes here before we take some Q&A is, how do we move forward once we've identified what segment or segments to go after? And it turns out those 9 areas rear their head again. And that if you can put together a rational plan that says, we've decided on who we're going to target, we've decided and identified what we call the compelling reason to buy, which is, what's the reason to, well, it's actually not even to buy. The better phrase is compelling reason to switch from the old way to the new way, from manual to automated, from gasoline to electric, from non-IoT, non-sensor devices to IoT. And it turns out each of these 9, your goal, and I think this is a goal that you can actually make happen with any of those areas, is can you put together a strategy that doesn't just hit on, we're going to scale by Q4, but put together a very specific level of attributes around this. And the book goes into it, our workshops go into it, our blogs have articles and so forth on it as well. But what I thought I'd finish with is those 9 areas that really help you execute. Each one of those has a question associated with it. And our rule of thumb is, if you can answer these 9 questions before you launch, and I mean like with confidence, then you have a high probability of hitting the right product market fit. If you say, you know what, we've got the sales strategy thing figured out, and we've got pricing figured out, but we're not so good on the problem analysis, like what are we really trying to solve as the problem? It's like, please go back to step 2. In fact, we sometimes get emails from people going, hey, you know, we heard you guys do work in positioning and messaging. Could you come and do a workshop for us on that? I go, yeah, we're happy to do that. But before you do that, have you figured out these yet? And they go, no, these are the hard ones. We thought we'd start with positioning and messaging. If you haven't figured out who you're going after and what their problem is and who your competitors are, what the heck chance do you have of positioning and messaging properly? So there actually is a sequence here, not just a deep dive into whichever one feels like it's the right one. And so what we find great companies doing is putting together really well-aligned 9-point strategies. And so the last 30 seconds of this is really to say, this is really easy to read somebody else's, but when you're staring at a blank sheet, and these are usually 10 to 15 slides, not just one slide, the idea is truly, can we get to some level of granularity? And it's not just the marketing people have to work on this. This is the body, the team. And so as we wrap this up and then take some Q&A, that third question around really how do we move forward, it turns out that the entire executive team has to be on board with this. So I'm going to ask you a favor. When you leave this session today, after refreshments, and somebody asks you, what did that guy Eckhart and the Chasm folks talk about when it came to this session, please don't say, oh, he talked about marketing strategy. He talked about market strategy. Those are different. Market strategy is how do we go to market. Marketing is a department, a very important department, but this has to be done by the team, by the executive team, not by marketing the department. Does that make sense? And so marketing plays a role, but it's not the only role. If you don't have your CEO and your finance and your support teams and your R&D aligned on this, then good luck to you. All right. So that's what I was hoping we could cover, including the 3 questions. I'm hoping this was kind of a useful construct to kind of go through. We've gone through it very quickly. I've got some really good examples in the books as well. What I'll do in a moment is turn it over to Anna, who's going to kind of facilitate and help us with maybe 3 or 4 questions, and then the rest Andrew and I will take in the refreshments area upstairs. Before I do that, I want to thank you for your time and your attention and being here. Thank you. If you're on LinkedIn, you want to be connected, we have blogs and articles and such. Be honored to connect with you if you'd like to do that. But at this point, let me turn it over to Anna.
Yeah, so we'll go ahead and take a couple of questions, maybe 3 or 4 questions. So if you have, we have mics on that side and a mic on this side. So if you have a question, just go ahead and raise your hand.
Front row.
All right, hey. I have a question on first mover advantage.
Yes.
I've just heard some different research that does argue for first mover advantage. So I just want to hear a little bit about why you say that it's a myth and really some of the background behind that.
Sure. I actually see and honored that you have a Tesla shirt on. Tesla was not the first high performance electric car. They're the first one to actually move across the chasm with it. And so we have out of the 225 companies we've worked with and studied, we have about 100 examples where first mover is mythology. You could take well-known examples. How about MySpace versus Facebook? MySpace had a multiple-year lead, and Facebook was the 4th one in the market, not the first one. I mentioned iPod. There were 9 other digital music players. You ever hear of Creative Technologies, Creative Labs? They were the Sound Blaster people from years ago, right, out of Singapore. They were actually one of the first digital music players. They were first or second, first mover, but early market, people loved them. Main marketplace, Apple kicked their you-know-what and got 80%. Today, I think Creative Technologies has 3% share worldwide in digital music, and half of that is in Singapore, and the other half is the rest of the world, so it's not feeling so good. So we have examples, and if you go to some of our blogs, you'll see that. It doesn't mean don't be innovative and don't be early. It just means don't get the hope up of just because you're first that the world owes you market dominance from your perspective. There's no correlation there with it. And I'm happy to challenge you on that if you ever want to bring up other examples like that. So great question, though. Thank you. Why don't we take 2 or 3 other questions before we finish? Anna, anybody else? Oh, yes. Great.
So how do you know when the competition's too strong? Like,
Wow.
how do you know when you're at a serious disadvantage versus, hey, we can go in and, they were first mover, but, maybe we can go in and knock them off the top?
Wow. Great question. You're sitting next to Sandra, so I figured there would be a good question coming from you. Okay, got it. So how late is too late? And how late is we can still catch up? The reason we stratify kind of the life cycle stages, and again, we went through this very quickly, that we say early market is a 1A, 1B, or 1C. If you have a category and it's in 1A or 1B, and it hasn't even crossed into the first bowling pin, the first segment yet, you are not too late. What we see is there's an accelerator, and it says once you're across the chasm, and that's why that indicator is such an important one, and it says if you are past what we call 3B or 3C, and you are not one of the top 3 players in the market, and I know the font's very small, if you're in transition from bowling alley to tornado, and you don't have an install base, and I mean like a real install base, and this market is taking off, and tornadoes last anywhere from 3 to 4 years to 5 years at the most, that you will lose. If you remember, before we all made photos on our smartphones, remember digital cameras, right? It turns out that, once again, by the way, early adopters and early launch, HP was one of the first 3 people to launch a digital camera. Didn't seem to help them much, right? It turns out that if you are here in 3B and 3C and the market ignites and you don't have whole product, which includes install base, legacy interface, all the things required, then there's a very good chance you're not going to make it through. And so part of it is we inside the company are the least likely people to judge because you're enthusiastic, you're aspirational, you're visionary. You go, hey, we came back last time. But for each one of these categories, it turns out that there's basically a level of at which point has the train really truly left the station, let's call it, and how do we actually move and find something else to do. If you're working on any of those, with the exception maybe of cloud, which there's a lot of cloud apps that have left the station, but in IoT or in blockchain or in a lot of AI, man, nobody's too late right now. There's plenty of wins, plenty of opportunity, plenty of revenue gain to be made. But it is a tough question to ask. And it's an ugly question because most people go, hey, we've been working on this for 3 years. What if we're late? How late is too late? So yes, so it's somewhere in that 3B, 3C category of the adoption curve. Let's take 1 or 2 other questions. We can find a few people with hands up. Great. Awesome, thanks.
Are there any benefits in entering a declining market?
Oh, wow. I don't get that question. Yes, there is. When we look at, well, entering or staying in would be the question. Declining markets, we actually talk about Main Street, and this is not the topic for today, but I have a slide here in case somebody in the room asks the question. And the question is, if you're in 5A or 5B and that market is declining, there's industry consolidation happening, people are getting out, somebody's left in the business. You can actually build a very nice margin business for 5 or 7 years at being one of the survivors in a declining market, as long as you're not one that's only having the price-sensitive customers or high cost structure and so forth. So yes, there's an opportunity there, but know your time, because at some point, every declining market has a decline that hits what we call the fault line. And what you don't want is for your company to become a verb, like getting Kodak'd. Getting Kodak means hanging on too long with the old chemical business, right? The silver halide business, knowing the market's renewing back, but not being able to manage it in a way, even though you tried, to actually get over into the digital business. And so the reality is, don't slide too far to the right. You've got to be careful about that. Let me finish it, Anna, with that as the question, because I know there's people that have another evening activity like dinner or something else coming up. We do have some refreshments, I think, as well. So let me turn it over to you, Anna, for some final words.
Michael, Andrew, thank you very much for coming on behalf of PARC. We appreciate your time. So he'll be up here signing some books if you want to bring your books down here. We also have refreshments outside. Just so that you know, on our website, if you want to sign up for the PARC Forum subscription for our PARC Forums, the next one is in 2 weeks, and it's Adam Chair, and he is the founder of Siri, who sold to Apple. So I think that will be a very special event as well. So thank you very much for coming.
Great, thank you. All right, good. Okay, thanks. All right, good.